Welcome to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Well, hello again, friends, and this is Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, episode 37 for Tuesday's reads. So I really haven't figured out what I was going to do for this one. Just pretty much read until I either get tired or I just run out. So I'm pretty much feeling like I just might run out of gas on this one. So when I'm done for this particular episode, that'll be it for it. So I was going to go into Eothen because we skipped that in the last Tuesday read. So we shall be continuing with chapter 6 from Eothen by Alexander Kinglake. Chapter 6, Greek Mariners. I sailed from Smyrna in the Amphitrite, a Greek brigantine, which was confidently said to be bound for the coast of Syria. But I knew that this announcement was not to be relied upon with positive certainty, for the Greek mariners are practically free from the stringency of ship's papers, and where they will, there they go. However, I had the whole of the cabin for myself, and my attendant, Misseri, subject only to the society of the captain at the hour of dinner, being at ease in this respect, being furnished too with plenty of books, and finding an unfailing source of interest in the thorough Greekness of my captain and my crew. I felt less anxious than most people would have been about the probable length of the cruise. I knew enough of Greek navigation to be sure that our vessel would cling to the earth like a child to its mother's knee, and that I should touch at many an isle before I set foot upon the Syrian coast. But I had no invidious preference for Europe, Asia, or Africa. I was safe from all danger of America, and I felt that I could defy the winds to blow me upon a coast that was blank and void of interest. My patience was extremely useful to me, for the cruise altogether endured some 40 days, and that in the midst of winter. According to me, the most interesting of all the Greeks, male Greeks, are the mariners, because their pursuits and their social condition are so nearly the same as those of their famous ancestors. You will say that the occupation of commerce must have smoothed down the salience of their minds, and this would be so, perhaps, if their mercantile affairs were conducted according to the fixed business-like routine of Europeans. But the ventures of the Greeks are surrounded by such a multitude of imagined dangers, and from the absence of regular marts, in which the true value of merchandise can be ascertained, are so entirely speculative, and besides, are conducted in a manner so wholly determined upon by the wayward fancies and wishes of the crew, that they belong to enterprise rather than to industry, and are very far indeed from tending to deaden any freshness of character. The vessels in which war and piracy were carried on during the years of the Greek Revolution became merchantmen at the end of the war, but the tactics of the Greeks as naval warriors were so exceedingly cautious that their habits as commercial mariners are so wild that the change has been more slight than you might imagine. The first care of Greek rajas, when they undertake a shipping enterprise, is to procure for their vessel the protection of some European power. This is easily managed by little intrigue, by a little intriguing with the dragoman of one of the embassies at Constantinople, and the craft soon glories in the ensign of Russia, or the dazzling tricolor, or the Union Jack. Thus, to the great delight of her crew, she enters upon the ocean world with a flaring light at her peak. But the independence of the vessel does no discredit to the borrowed flag. She is frail, indeed, but it is gracefully built and smartly rigged. She always carries guns, and in short, gives good promise of mischief and speed. So, just to put that in context, he says Constantinople. So that is before the Turks came in of the Byzantine Empire and turned it into Istanbul. So that's Constantinople is in Turkey, and that obviously this was written before it happened. He was still calling it Constantinople. So that is interesting. Good to know. Carrying on. The privileges attached to the vessel and her crew by virtue of the borrowed flag are so great as to imply a liberty wider even than that which is often enjoyed in our more strictly civilized countries, so that there is no good ground for saying that the development of the true character belonging to Greek mariners is prevented by the dominion of the Ottoman. These men are free, too, from the power of the great capitalists, a power more withering than despotism itself to the enterprises of humble venturers. The capital employed is supplied by those whose labor is to render it productive. The crew receive no wages, but have all of the share in the venture, and in general, I believe they are the owners of the whole freight. They choose a captain to whom they entrust just power enough to keep the vessel on her course in fine weather, but not quite enough for a gale of wind. They also elect a cook and a mate. The cook, whom we had on board, was particularly careful about the ship's reckoning. And when, under the influence of the keen sea breezes, we grew fondly expectant of an instant dinner, the great author of Pelops would be standing on deck with an ancient quadrant in his hands, calmly affecting to take an observation. But then, to make up for this, the captain would be exercising a controlling influence over the soup, so that all in the end went well. Our mate was a Hydriot, a native of that island rock which grows nothing but mariners and mariners' wives. His character seemed to be exactly that which is generally attributed to the Hadriot race. He was fierce and gloomy and lonely in his ways. One of his principal duties seemed to be that of acting as counter captain or leader of the opposition, denouncing the first symptoms of tyranny and protecting even the cabin boy from oppression. Besides this, when things went smoothly, he would begin to prognosticate evil in order that his more light-hearted comrades might not be puffed up with the seeming good fortune of the moment. It seemed to me that the personal freedom of these sailors, who own no superiors except those of their own choice, is as like as many as may be to that of their seafaring ancestors, and even in their mode of navigation they have admitted no such an entire change as you would suppose probable. It is true that they have so far availed themselves of modern discoveries as to look to the compass instead of the stars, and that they have superseded the immortal gods of their forefathers by St. Nicholas in his glass case. Footnote: St. Nicholas is the great patron of Greek sailors. A small picture of him enclosed in a glass case is hung up like a barometer at the end of the cabin. That's interesting. But they are not yet so confident either of their needle or their saint as to love an open sea, and they still hug their shores as fondly as the Argonauts of old. Indeed, they have a most unsailor-like love for the land, and I really believe that in a gale of wind they would rather have a rock-bound coast on their lee than no coast at all. According to the notions of an English seaman, this kind of navigation would soon bring the vessel on which it might be practiced to an evil end. The Greek, however, is unaccountably successful in escaping the consequences of being jammed in, as it is called, upon a lee shore. These seamen, like their forefathers, rely upon no winds unless they are right astern or on the quarter. They rarely go on a wind if it blows at all fresh, and if the adverse breeze approaches to a gale, they at once fumigate St. Nicholas and put up the helm. The consequence, of course, is that under the ever-varying winds of the Aegean, they are blown about in the most whimsical manner. I used to think that Ulysses, with his 10 years' voyage, had taken his time in making Ithaca, but my experience in the Greek navigation soon made me understand that he had had, in point of fact, a pretty good average passage. Such are now the mariners of the Aegean, free, equal amongst themselves, navigating the sea of their forefathers, which the same heroic yet childlike spirit of venture, the same half-trustful reliance upon heavenly aid. They are the liveliest images of true old Greeks that time and the new religions have spared to us. With one exception, our crew were a solemn company, and yet, sometimes, if all things went well, they would relax their austerity and show a disposition to fun, or rather to quiet humor. When this happened, they invariably had recourse to one of their number, who went by the name of Admiral Niccolo. He was an amusing fellow, the poorest, I believe, and the least thoughtful of the crew, but full of rich humor. His oft-told story of the events by which he had gained the sobriquet of Admiral never failed to delight his hearers, and when he was desired to repeat it for my benefit, the rest of the crew crowded round with as much interest as if they were listening to the tale for the first time. The tale was this: a number of Greek brigs and brigantines were at anchor in the bay at Beirut. A festival of some kind particularly attractive to the sailors was going on in the town, and whether with or without leave I know not, the crews of all the craft except that of Niccolo had gone ashore. On board his vessel she carried dollars. There was, it would seem, a more careful or more influential captain, a man who was able to enforce his determination that at least one of the crew should be left on board. Niccolo's good nature was with him so powerful an impulse that he could not resist the delight of volunteering to stay with the vessel whilst his comrades went ashore. His proposal was accepted, and the crew and the captain soon left him alone on the deck of his vessel. The sailors, gathering together from their several ships, were amusing themselves in the town, when suddenly there came down from betwixt the mountains one of those sudden hurricanes which sometimes occur in the southern climes. Niccolo's vessel, together with 4 of the craft which had been left unmanned, broke from her moorings, and all 5 of the vessels were carried out seaward. The town is on a salient point at the southern side of the bay, so that the admiral was close under the eyes of the inhabitants and the shore-gone sailors, when he gallantly drifted out at the base of the head with his little fleet. If Niccolo could not entirely control the maneuvers of the squadron, there was at least no human power to divide his authority, and thus it was he took rank as admiral. Niccolo cut his cable, and so for the time saved his vessel. The rest of the fleet under his command were quickly wrecked, whilst the admiral got away clear to the open sea. The violence of the squall soon passed off, but Niccolo felt that his chance of one day resigning his high duties as an admiral for the enjoyments of private life on the steadfast shore mainly depended upon his success in working the brig with his own hands. So, after calling on his namesake, the Saint, not for the first time, I take it, he got up some canvas and took the helm. He became equal, he told us, to a score of Nicholas. And the vessel, as he said, was manned with his terrors. For 2 days it seemed he cruised at large, but at last, either by his seamanship or by the natural instinct of the Greek mariners for finding land, he brought his craft close to an unknown shore that promised well for his purpose of running in the vessel, and he was preparing to give her a good berth on the beach when he saw a gang of ferocious-looking fellows coming down to the point for which he was making. Poor Niccolo was a perfectly unlettered and untutored genius, and for that reason, perhaps, a keen listener to tales of terror. His mind had been impressed with some horrible legend of cannibalism, and he now did not doubt for a moment that the men awaiting on him on the beach were the monsters at whom he had shuddered in the days of his childhood. The coast on which Niccolo was running his vessels was somewhere, I fancy, at the foot of the Anzari mountains, and the fellows who were preparing to give him a reception were probably very rough specimens of humanity. It is likely enough that they might have given themselves the trouble of putting the admiral to death, for the purpose of simplifying their claim to the vessel, and preventing litigation. but the notion of their cannibalism was of course utterly unfounded. Niccolo's terror, however, so graven the idea on his mind that he could not never after dismiss it. Having once determined the character of his expectant hosts, the admiral naturally thought that it would be better to keep their dinner waiting any length of time than to attend their feast in the character of a roasted Greek. So he put about his vessel and tempted the deep once more. After a further cruise, the lonely commander ran his vessel upon some rocks at another part of the coast. There she was lost with her treasures, and Niccolo was but too glad to scramble ashore, though without $1 in his girdle. These adventures seem flat enough as I repeat them, but the hero expressed his terrors by such odd terms of speech and such strangely humorous gestures that the story came from his lips with an unfailing zest, so that the crew, who had heard the tale so often, could still enjoy to their hearts the rich fright of the admiral, and still shudder with unabated horror when he came to the loss of the dollars. The power of listening to long stories, and for this, by the by, I am giving you large credit, is common, I fancy, to most sailors, and the Greeks have it to a high degree, for they can be perfectly patient under a narrative of 2 or 3 hours duration. These long stories are mostly founded upon Oriental topics, and in one of them I recognized with some alteration an old friend of the Arabian Nights. I inquired as to the source from which the story had been derived, and the crew all agreed that it had been handed down unwritten from Greek to Greek. Their account of the matter does not, perhaps, go very far towards showing the real origin of the tale, but when I afterwards took up the Arabian Nights, I became strongly impressed with the notion that they must have sprung from the brain of a Greek. It seems to me that these stories, whilst they disclose a complete and habitual knowledge of things Asiatic, have about them so much of freshness and life, so much of the stirring and volatile European character, that they cannot have owed their conception to a mere Oriental, who, for creative purposes, is a thing dead and dry, a mental mummy that may have been a live king just after the flood, but has since lain balmed in spice. At the time of the Caliphate, the Greek race was familiar enough to Baghdad. They were the merchants, the peddlers, the barbers, and intriguers general of southwestern Asia, and therefore the Oriental materials with which the Arabian tales were wrought must have been completely at the command of the inventive people to whom I would attribute their origin. We were nearing the Isle of Cyprus when there arose half a gale of wind, with a heavy chopping sea. My Greek seamen considered that the weather amounted not to a half, but to an integral gale of wind at the very least. So they put up the helm and scudded for 20 hours. When we neared the main land of Anadoli, the gale ceased, and a favorable breeze springing up soon brought us off Cyprus once more. Afterwards the wind changed again, but we were still able to lay our course by the sailing close hauled. We were at length in such a position that, by holding on our course for about half an hour, we should get under the lee of the island and find ourselves in smooth water. But the wind had been gradually freshening. It now blew hard, and there was a heavy sea running. As the grounds for alarm arose, the crew gathered together in one close group. They stood pale and grim under their hooded capotes, like monks, awaiting a massacre, anxiously looking by turns along the pathway of the storm, and then upon each other, and then upon the eye of the captain, who stood by the helmsman. Presently the Hadriot came aft, more moody than ever, the bearer of fierce remonstrance against the continuing of the struggle. He received a resolute answer, and still we held our course. Soon there came a heavy sea that caught the bow of the brigantine as she lay jammed in betwixt the waves. She bowed her head low under the waters and shuddered through all her timbers, then gallantly stood up again over the striving sea with bowsprit entire. But where were the crew? It was a crew no longer, but rather a gathering of Greek citizens. The shout of the seamen were changed for the murmuring of the people. The spirit of the old Demos was alive. The men came aft in a body and loudly asked that the vessel should be put about, and that the storm be no longer tempted. Now then for speeches. The captain, his eyes flashing fire, his frame all quivering with emotion, wielding his every limb like another and a louder voice, pours forth the eloquent torrent of his threats and his reasons, his commands and his prayers. He promises, he vows, he swears that there is safety in holding on, safety if Greeks will be brave. The men hear and are moved, but the gale rouses itself once more, and again the raging seas come trampling over the timbers that are the life of all. The fierce Hadriot advances one step nearer to the captain, and the angry growl of the people goes floating down the wind. But they listen, waver once more resolve, then waver again, thus doubtfully, hanging between the terrors of the storm and the persuasion of the glorious speech, as though it were the Athenian that talked, and Philip of Macedon that thundered on the weather bow. Brave thoughts winged on Grecian words gained their natural mastery over terror. The brigantine held on her course and reached smooth water at last. I landed at Limassol, the westernmost port of Cyprus, leaving the brigantine to sail for Larnaca, and there await my arrival. So that was chapter 6 of Eothen. Wonder what he'll get up to next time. So I will be right back after this short break. Stick around for a bit. All right, and welcome back, and thanks for sticking around. So, we'll be continuing with the Book of Brave Deeds, and tonight, this story is about Joan of Arc. Um, some others might actually see it as Jeanne d'Arc, um, D apostrophe ARC. That's what it means. The D with an apostrophe means of in French. So, yeah, so there you go. Small little language lesson for you there. Joan of Arc, From Brave Lives and Noble, by Clara L. Ma- Matau. Matau, Mateaux. One thing was plain to all who listened to the confused news that reached such places as Dom Remy, and that was, could Prince Charles once be properly crowned at the Reims, after the fashion of his great ancestors, there would be comparative safety, but that could not be done unless the city of Orleans should be properly protected. But how? But how? Was the question. It seemed unanswerable. How indeed? Grumbled a disabled soldier who had begged a loaf, and in return was telling the last ill news concerning the Battle of Herrings. Hearts and arms have grown craven before these island warriors. As things are, nothing less than a miracle can set the crown on our Charles's head. Uncrowned, he is helpless and lost. The young girl, she was but 16, wandered away, her heart full of excitement and indignation, as she looked up at the stars shining softly over the beech tree, and thought of the tradition of that maid who was to serve her country. And presently, in the dim light, a strange glamour taking possession of Joan, it seemed to her as if she were aflame, and heard a voice bidding her to be brave and good, as, as became the chosen one. Her task was the making a way clear for the Prince Charles, who, through her means, should be victoriously crowned at Rheims and save France. Faith had not died out of Joan's heart, at any rate. She could not rest for thinking of this strange fancy of her overexcited mind. Again and again it occurred, and at last she was bidden to go at once to the governor of Vaucluse and reveal her vision to him, which she did after many difficulties and much opposition from her parents, who thought their girl gone mad, and besought her with tears to be still. When she stood before the officer, a mere country child in a shabby red stuff dress, and told him she was appointed to drive the hated English out of France, after seeing the Dauphin crowned at Rheims, he laughed rudely in her face, and ordered her to be off home and cease bragging. Charles, with his followers, was 400 miles away, his exchequer empty, his useless soldiers desperate and downcast, perhaps because of all of this. He did not laugh at this strange story of an inspired village maid. He was not ready to throw away even so slight a chance. Besides, he and his counselors being in extremity, and those being days when strange causes turn the affairs of nations, it was worth trying what the girl's claim to the miraculous might be worth. And there is a colored illustration here. They sent for her more by the way of a passing amusement than aught else, and she came joyfully and ready. A great crowd of knights, splendidly attired, filled the large hall into which this poor farmer's maid was shown. The prince stood in the background, looking neither to the right nor left. She advanced, and kneeling instantly before Charles, claimed, without hesitation or tremor, "God give you good life, my gentle king." "It is not I who am king," he replied hastily to try her. "It is you, and no other, sir. I am Joan, Joan of Arc, come by God's order to announce that you will be crowned at Rheims, and that I am to aid you in the siege of Orleans." The Dauphin led Joan aside and held long and serious conference with her. Then he came back, declaring that she had revealed to him things known only to himself and God, and that he believed her inspired. After this, a suit of armor was made for her. She girded on a sword which was found, as she said it would be buried by the altar of St. Catherine, and she was presented to the excited multitude mounted on a war steed, which she managed with all ease and grace. The people were now as excited with hope as they had been depressed with despair, and clamored loudly for this young prophetess to lead them against the English, who were invading and spoiling their land. And so it was 7,000 men, full of hope and enthusiasm, marched forth, headed by the maid, and above her floated a white banner, on which was the fair inscription, "Jesue Marie." And by her rode a valiant and rode by her valiant captains, marshaled by the Dunois, the brave old fighting men who would fain have advised from long experience. But that she would not. Yet all she did and ordered proved strangely successful, and soon were all content to be guided by this fearless village girl, Joan, or rather Jeanne d'Arc of Domremy, who, believing herself inspired all about her. At first, the English laughed aloud at the report that an obscure village maid was advancing to give them fortresses, and reduced to its last extremity. I'm sorry, Panda is wanting to be part of the show today. Hold on. Where are you going? Where are you going? Oh no! Okay. I'll try to hurry. Where was I? Oh no. Orleans was closely begirt with hostile fortresses, and reduced to its last extremity. What could an army headed by a girl avail the good city in this dire plight? But a strange, cold trepidation soon unnerved their warlike arms. What if the holy saints were indeed with the strange commander, or even supposing she were a sorceress and witch, a worse reputation by far in those days, both in French and English eyes. However, they boldly prepared to repulse her. Let her be what she would else. She would else. Gracious goodness. Hold on, I've got to find my place again. I lost it. What if the holy saints were indeed with the strange commander, or even supposing she were a sorceress and witch, a worse reputation by far in those days, both in French and English eyes? However, they boldly prepared to repulse her. Let her be what she would else. She was but a woman. She could know naught of the difficulties of a siege, and the valor of English soldiers. But little Joan seemed to know more than all about the weather-beaten men of war about her, and prepared at once to relieve the city. First, however, in the name of St. Catherine, she ordered that all bad characters should leave the camp, and that all soldiers should attend Mass and confess their sins with humbleness and contrition. This done, they were to march to the attack. Right through the crowded English forces, with which were garrisoned, and there's a very naughty cat. Hold on just a minute. This done, they were to march to the attack, right through the crowded English forces, which were garrisoned in forts that, except at the river Loire, approached, encircled Orleans in the most impregnable chain. Who does not know the rest of this strange story? How the young maid in shining armor led the soldiers, exhorting, rallying, sweeping all before her, fighting with the vigor of a man at arms and the enthusiasm of a crusader here, there, and everywhere, until panic seized upon the English soldiers, and they flung down their arms and fled before this strange champion, and at last left a clear way to open to Rheims, where, with the Maid of Orleans at his right hand, was solemnly crowned Charles the King. Her task finished, she begged to return to Dom Remy. It was, however, not to be, though she vowed, almost with tears, that the skill and the cunning had departed from her. She was prevailed upon to stay, and all heavy-hearted, led that fatal sally, where she was at length unhorsed, wounded, and taken prisoner. A joyous Te Deum being raised by the captors of this heroine of 17, who had baffled and defeated their bravest and best. And that was the conclusion of the story of Joan of Arc in the Book of Brave Deeds. And next time we shall visit Sir Philip Sidney. So I'm looking forward to that. I hope you are too. And I hope you enjoyed this episode, as I'm going to close out and tend to domestic goddess issues with the cat. You have a good night. Take care. Thanks for watching. If you found this inspirational, educational, or any other type of then please like, subscribe, and share. And if you're a little confused, please leave a comment in the comment section below. Thanks. Have a good night.